I want to talk about a subject today, and I think what I'll do here is I'm going to begin this as not a part one, but hopefully one of a series that I want to do over the course of the year. And the series would come under the title of Lesser Known Characters in the Bible. Lesser Known Characters in the Bible. Because I was doing some research a few months ago and I came across something that just absolutely fascinated me about one of the characters in the Bible. And I don't remember hearing about this person. Now, how many people know Benaiah? Benaiah. All them looks. Okay, got a couple hands went up. Got a couple hands went up. My hand wouldn't have went up. All right, Benaiah. All right, the rest of us are in denial. We don't know Benaiah. All right? Benaiah. I'm going to talk about Benaiah today. All right, we're going to talk about Benaiah. Because you see, we focus on so many characters in the Bible, but they seem to tend to focus around certain specifics. We'd find the characters in Hebrews 11. All right, Hebrews 11, you got, the faith chapter, you got Abraham. You got all these giants in the Bible. You talk about the Apostle Paul, you talk about King David, all these people. But the Bible's got tons of people, little bits of information that for some reason are overlooked. So I'm going to give you what this man has been written about in the Bible first, just to get your attention. And then I want to go back and go through the Bible and read some of those events and what we can glean from them and how they apply today. Now, Benaiah was an incredibly powerful, fearless, faithful individual. Let me tell you what he was. I'm going to give you all the things that he was. And then we'll go back through the Bible and start discussing them. Now, the Bible doesn't give us a lot of information about each of the things, but it does describe things that he did. All right, first of all, he was a general in King David's army. All right? He was a general in King David's army. Now, in Israel at that time, very much like they do today, they rotate the military. They rotate everybody in Israel. If you were born in Israel, every man and woman and child grows up eventually, has to serve in the military in some way, shape, or form. That's the way it is. Well, in Israel, what they would have is they had a standing army that rotated. And they would be the ones who would be in charge. Every month, they would have 24,000 soldiers in duty every month. And they would rotate. Each different month, there'd be a separate 24,000 every month. Each month, they had a separate general. In the third month, the general was Benaiah. And it was his responsibility in the third month of the year that he would be the general in charge of those 24,000 men. Now, that's pretty phenomenal in itself. He'd be ranked right up there with the top generals in America today. He would be one that the leadership, that the kings, the president, they would be talking to him for advice and counsel on what to do. So that alone tells us this man not only had to be fearless, he had to be pretty intelligent to be able to work with and oversee this many troops. All right. He became the captain of David's personal bodyguard. He was the captain of David's personal bodyguard. So that's pretty important. So not only was he powerful, fearless, and smart, but he developed the trust that the king, and you know how many people tried to kill King David. David had to put a lot of faith in this man's character and trust. He was listed as one of the 30 of David's mighty men. One of the 30 of David's mighty men. Not only that, he was listed right at the top 3, although not in the top 3. And I'll show you what the top 3 did in just a few minutes. To be listed in that top 3 was incredible. Like, for example, one of the top 3 in one battle killed 800 Philistines. Single-handed. So, I mean, when you're going for if you got the gold, the silver, and the bronze, I mean, when you read what this guy did, you don't even make the top 3. That's amazing what these people were. What else was amazing? How God, when he plans something, he raises someone to power, is how God builds around that individual or that plan the protection and brings in the need to keep everything safe. Just like in Israel today, when you look at the generals in Israel today, they are fearless. They're absolutely fearless. And, you know, it's nothing for them to jump in a plane or grab a truck or a tank or a missile and run out there and put their lives on the line. All right, what else did he do? He personally defeated 2 of the Moabites' mightiest warriors. These men were legendary warriors in their day. He personally took them on and defeated them. He went after an Egyptian soldier, an elite soldier that was about 300 pounds, 7.5 feet tall, carrying a sword or a spear of some type. And he mentioned this because this thing was huge that he was carrying, and he went after him with a club. With a club, a piece of wood, a staff. And he went and beat that Egyptian until he took the sword away from him and slew the Egyptian with his own sword. It's fearless. All right, what else did he do? At some point in time, we don't know why, in the middle of a very cold winter, he jumped into a pit with a lion and slew the lion. Who does that? But the Bible records it. Now, you got to figure, you know, all that snow, it's kind of slippery. Why jump in there for the lion? There's a couple of things that people have some ideas might have took place, but nobody really knows. When David was thirsty one day, and he was in a cave area, it was a fortress, he got very thirsty. They had the Philistines were in Bethlehem, and they had covered all the water areas, and they were down in the streams and the brooks, and they were like grasshoppers all over the place. David mentions, he says, boy, you know, I would surely like to have a drink of that water out of one of those streams down in Bethlehem. Well, he rounds up 2 other guys, runs across the land, down into the camp of the Philistines, slew a bunch of people, grabbed King David some water, ran back, broke through the lines again, and brings David some water. Now, we don't talk about this guy for some reason. Now, did that get your attention? Now, that got my attention. And so I said, what in the world was this guy, what's he doing? And the last thing he did, there was a coup that was taking place when David was dying. And Solomon was supposed to reign. One of the other sons formed a coup and declared himself the king. And this man, along with Nathan and one other person, along with Solomon's mother, was able to stay off a coup of the kingdom, splitting and dividing at the death of David. This man is a mighty man of God. I want to talk about that man today, because I think there's things that God's left for us in this part of the lesser-known characters of the Bible that I think we can glean from and get a lot of information. So what I want to do is I just want to go through some of the scriptures that talk about some of his events. I want to talk about his name, basically his heritage, to give you an idea where he came from. When we look at that, we begin to see why it's so important that we help our youth, our young people, and those around us to be given the right environment so that as they grow up, they build this mental psychology of faith and of love and trust in God and fearlessness at the same time. Because you see, we're moving to a time where it's going to take courage to hold your faith. You know, because we're going to be inundated with attacks from every area, and you're going to be attacked from the least expected areas. You may be attacked from family members that are outside the church. You may be attacked from brethren who are in the church. You know, I've always said it, a person who goes to church doesn't always mean they're converted. A person who goes to church who is converted doesn't always stay converted. Sometimes we return to carnality. And I'm talking from experience, me. I try not to. I do my very best. But I can look back over my life, and I know especially in my early years in the church, half of my life I've spent messing it up, and the other half trying to put it back together. All right, so now let's talk about Benaiah. His name comes from two basic Hebrew root words. The first one is bana, B-A-N-A, which means to build. All right, to build. And the second is Jah, or the Lord. All right, and so to build in the Lord. So when you put them together, the name really means made by the Lord, or God has built. You know, any type of interpretation that centers around that would be appropriate. In other words, this man's name, back then their names always reflected their character and their nature. So when he was given this name, basically God inspired this name is to say that he was going to take this individual and his nature, his character, his upbringing would all center around being built by God, which is very, very important. All right. And when you read about him, let's go to 1 Chronicles chapter, I'm going to take it back. Let's go to 2 Samuel 8, verse 18 first. And it tells us about his beginnings. So what I want you to do today is simply just write the scriptures down. And then when you have time, go home and just look through these scriptures and try to meditate on them and see what you can glean from them. Because the more you think about this, more and more information is going to come out. For example, as I meditated on this, what made those three men break down through the Philistines to go get the water? Can you imagine when David says, I'm thirsty, I sure would like to have a drink from one of those streams down in Bethlehem. What went through those three men's minds? They had to get away from David. So my mind's thinking, what kind of communication did these three men have? When they walked out of his sight, they had to sit down, and it's almost like they would prod one another and say, what do you think? You think we can go get some water for him? You think he'd be surprised? Hey, man, this is a challenge. Let's just do it. God will protect us. And what went through their mind? You know, you don't know, but I like to imagine what went on. Now, I'll never know what went on until Christ returns. We'll be able to see. But one thing I do know, somewhere there had to be a communication between those three men who say, let's do that. This would really be neat. Let's go do this. Whereas you might get together with someone else and saying, oh, you're absolutely insane. There's tens of thousands of men down there. We're going to get killed. But these three men said, let's do it. Let's go bring King David some water. Now, that wasn't out of duty. That wasn't out of service. You know what that was out of? When you look at what this was, that was out of love for their king. That was out of love for their king. So now, as I begin to meditate about, well, these men are doing this out of love because no one required it. They had to sneak away from David because David didn't know it. In fact, when we get to the story, you'll see that when he brought the water back, David felt so bad, he poured it out. He wouldn't even drink it because these men risked their lives because he didn't want them to do it again. In other words, don't put your lives on the line to do this for me. That's not right. And he felt guilty that happened, so he poured the water out. He didn't even drink it. All right, so what do I learn from that? While you're home meditating, let me tell you what else I learned from that. God doesn't require you to go beyond certain areas. He said, this is your duty before God. All right? So as I'm imagining, the love of God doesn't stop in my service because that's my duty. The love of God is say, what else can I do? What can I do in my life to please God? All right? Because the New Testament tells us that at that particular point in time when it says when you have done all that you're supposed to do, what does the Bible say? You're still an unworthy servant. Why? Because you only did what's required. Everybody does that, or supposed to do that. It is in going beyond your service toward God and your service toward your fellow man that shows your love. That's what these three men did. And so as you go through and you meditate, you try to imagine what's taking place here. What's going on behind the scenes? What made these men do that? But one thing's for sure, it had to be the love of David to do that, because they put their lives on the line. All right, now we're in 2 Samuel 8, verse 15. So David reigned over all of Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was the recorder. Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were the priest. Sariah was secretary, and Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada. Now, the reason they say this, Jehoiada, the son of, when they're talking about this Benaiah, is because that name was common back in that day. And you'll read in the Bible there's several different people who had that name. And so what it does is it isolates to make sure that we know which one we're talking about here. It was a common name like John would be during John the Baptist's day, would be John. So it says Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were royal advisors. And so here we have, tells us beginning with who Benaiah was, that he was over these two families, the Kerites and the Pelethites. They were, from all indication, a mercenary type of war people. They were in the land of Israel. And they believed, I mean, they can tell you where the cities were. They dwelt between, like, where Syria, below where Turkey is today, north of Egypt. And they covered in those particular areas. And they were more of a warlike, fearless people. He was over them when all this began to take place. Now, his dad. So to give you an idea, now we get to know a little bit about who Benaiah is, because we look at his dad. Who was his dad? All right, so we look at, let's go to 1 Chronicles chapter 12, to give you an idea who the dad is. 1 Chronicles chapter 12. And I'm going to begin reading in verse 23. Now, this is when David was beginning to take charge. David's going to be over, and he's going to be in charge after Saul. And this is toward the beginning of David's reign. It says in verse 23, now these are the numbers of the men armed for battle who came to David at Hebron to turn Saul's kingdom over to him, as the Lord had said. Verse 24, the men of Judah carrying a shield and a spear, 6,800 armed men for battle. Now, I'm reading from the NIV. In case you're using King James right now, I'm using the NIV today because it's a little bit easier to follow the way this is worded in my sermon. All right, so Judah's there. They got 6,800 armed men at the beginning. The men of Simeon were warriors ready for battle, 7,100. All right, verse 26. The men of Levi, 4,600. 27, including Jehoiada, the leader of the family of Aaron, who had 3,700 men. All right, so here's what we understand. Benaiah, who grew up and raised, is the son of Jehoiada, and he was a general and a leader of the army of the family of Aaron. So as he grew up as a child, he grew up in the middle of an army type family. So he was involved with generals and the colonels, and like we would know them today, the captains of 100, the captains of 10,000 or whatever. So he had that in his background. Not only that, because of the family of Aaron, the family of Aaron were closely tied into the Levitical priesthood areas, and they would be intertwined and communicate a lot. So he was closely tied into a religious background at the same time because of the intermingling of the families and communication lines. So as he grew up as a child, what did he have? His upbringing was that of a military background, of a father who was like a general over these people and these families, and he grew up intermingling with all these people who built courage, strength, and faith and trust in God. In the middle of that, they were close to the priesthood and their families, so he brought in a religious background, bringing all this to a godly point to build in a military family the trust in God. So that when he grew up, all he knew was what he learned as a child. So when you look at his name, made by the Lord, he literally was. He was personally made by God through his upbringing, his teaching, his tutoring, his family, and his connections. I mean, this is really important for one individual and the kind of upbringing that you would have. And God did that to do what? To put him next to David to protect the king. That's so important. I mean, this position, I mean, it is so imperative that this position be held by someone of trust, because there was always someone trying to come behind, including David's family, to take over or to kill David. Because, you know, you look in the book of Psalms, and David's saying, all my enemies, and everybody was against him at some point. You know, so this particular individual gained the trust of the king of Israel. Oh, there was one more thing I didn't even cover in the thing. What else he did? Because of his love toward Solomon's dad, when Solomon took over, he made him in charge of the entire army. That was one more thing that he did that I didn't even mention at the beginning. He became, when Solomon ruled, he was in charge of the entire army because of his protection for David. Okay. All right, so now let's move on to talk about what he was in competition with to be part of the 30. David's mighty men, the 30 men. So we're going to pick up that story in 2 Samuel 23. And I'm going to read from verse 8. Read from verse 8. I believe that's where it's at. Let me go in. I printed these out because I print them out now when I'm up here because we got lighting now, but my eyes aren't as good as the lighting sometimes. I just want to make sure I've got the right thing printed out, that I'm sending you to the right spot. All right, so it's 2 Samuel. Now, is that in the New Testament or the Old Testament? All right, 2 Samuel 23. I just want to make sure I'm in the right book. Sometimes I transpose when I'm putting the notes together at the last minute. And verse 8. All right, that's where I want to be. All right, so now I can read it on big print. There we go. All right, these are the names, 2 Samuel 23, verse 8. These are the names of David's mighty men. I know I'm not going to get all these names correct. I may never get even one of them correct. Who knows? All right. You know, I pronounced these at home and it seemed to work, but now I'm trying to do it up here and it doesn't even look right. All right. Jehoash Bethsheba was Tecumite, who was the chief of 3. He raised a spear against 800 men whom he killed in one encounter. All right, so you got 30 men. Here's a guy goes out and kills 800 men at one time. That's that's ruthless. I mean, and you're still alive. All right, so whom he killed in one encounter. All right, now, Benaiah was one of the top 30, and says he's right up there with the top 3, but not in the top 3. I mean, to qualify for the top 3, 800 people. You're in a battle, and you personally slaughter 800 people. That's amazing. All right, verse 9. Next to him was Eleazar, the son of Dodai, the Ahohite, as one of the 3 mighty men. He was with David when he taunted the Philistines and gathered for battle, that the men of Israel retreated. So here, let me give you the setting. They're in a field of food that's being grown for the king. He starts taunting the Philistines, the second of the 30. The Philistines come after them after this taunting, and the armies of Israel runs. They run. This man stayed in the middle to protect the food. by himself against the army of the Philistines. Now, you got to picture what's going on here, because this is not normal. These men were fearless. So he taunted the Philistines and gathered for battle, and these were the men that Israel retreated. But he stood his ground, and he struck down the Philistines till his hands grew tired and froze to the sword. Now, what does that mean? Have you ever been working with a hammer, and you wear your muscles out, and eventually the muscles cramp up, and you can't open your hand? This man was slaying so many Philistines that at some point his arm cramps up, his hands cramp up, and he can't get the sword out. So God gives him the strength that he can't stop fighting because the sword won't even come out of his hand. Can you imagine that? It says, and so he says that until his hand grew tired and froze to the sword. And the Lord brought a great victory that day. Then the troops returned to Eleazar, but only to strip the dead. He killed so many that when the army came back, they just went through the fields, stripping all the dead Philistines. That's number 2 of the top 30. Next to him, verse 11. Next to him was Shammah, the son of Agee, the Harite. And when the Philistines banded together at a place which was in a field full of lentils, and the Israel troops fled from there, but Shammah took his stand in the middle of the field and defended and struck down in the field and brought about a great victory. All right. I might have the story mixed up a little bit. All right. So same principle where he's in the middle of the field with the Philistines, and he does the exact same thing and brings about a great victory. These are the top 3 of the 30. And it goes through and gives us a little bit about the others. So I'm going to come down now. Let's go through reading now from verse 13. During harvest time, 3 of the 30 of the chief men came down to David at the cave of Adullam, while a band of the Philistines were encamped in the valley of Rephaim. And David was in the stronghold at the Philistine garrison, which was at Bethlehem. And David longed for water and said, "Oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem." He was just thinking out loud. He says, "Boy, would it be so nice to have a drink of that fresh water." And so 3 mighty men broke through the Philistine lines, drew the water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem, and carried it back to David. But he refused to drink it, but instead he poured it out before the Lord. And he said, "Far be it from me, O Lord, to do this." And he said, "It is not the blood of men that went at risk of their lives." And David would not drink it, and such were the exploits of these 3 mighty men. All right, so David, God blessed David and surrounded him with an incredible men of faith, of loyalty, of courage, and of strength. Now, verse 18. Now, Abishai was the brother of Joab, son of Zeruiah, which was the chief of the 3. So of those 3 that they're talking about, this guy was in charge of the 3. And he raised a spear against 300 men whom he killed, and so he became as famous as the 3, but he was not held in greater honor than the 3. In other words, he killed 300 men, but he didn't make the top 3. In other words, he got honorable mention. you get honorable mention. So if he was at the Olympics and they ran the race, the first 3 got to stand on a podium, but the other ones, they get honorable mention. That's all. So this guy, but anyway, God made him in charge of over them, because whatever his wisdom was, God put him in charge. But he still wasn't as famous as the top 3, who was pretty close. All right, going on. Then it comes to verse 20. Now we bring in Benaiah. So this is who we're looking at. Benaiah is in the company of this type of people. They communicated with one another. They would sit around, they would joke, they would laugh, they'd have drinks together, they would talk about their exploits and the things that they could do. And so now we're down to verse 20, and we're talking about Benaiah. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was a valiant fighter from Kabzeel. And Kabzeel was in the southern part of Judah. It was a city close to the southern borders, and he was a fighter from there who performed great exploits. He struck down 2 of Moab's best men. So he also went down to a pit on a snowy day, and he killed the lion. Now, I had it here somewhere, if I can find it right quick, of these 2 men. When you look at these 2 men, because you got to look at the wording in here, and depending on which translation you would go into, it says it's in one translation, in one concordance says that these 2 Moabite warriors are described by various translations as 2 of the Moab's best men. I mean, it was like if you took of David's top 30 and you took the top 2, that's who Benaiah was fighting. It would be like the top 2, the guy like who killed 800 men, or one guy who stood in the middle of a field and just slaughtered until his hand froze to the sword. That's who Benaiah was going against, was Moab's best men. All right, they're also described as champions. These were the Moabite champions of their cities, or they were also known as distinguished soldiers. One translation also says that these were men of uncommon valor and fortitude. It would be like somebody playing Little League football on a field going against somebody playing for the Saints. That's the type of analogy that you're looking at here. That's what they were up against. But he was fearless. It didn't bother him one bit to go against these men. And he slew them. And he slew them. Now, why does a person jump into a pit to kill a lion? Now, it's as amazing as you go through and you think about this, it's not really known why he did that. The lion was already in the pit. If he's in the pit, he's not going to come out. One not a concordance, but one dictionary talks about the Bible, brings out an interesting thought, is that the man had not only courage, but he had fortitude, and he seemed to have the inside himself the presence to be concerned about an animal suffering. Now, this was interesting. He says the lion couldn't get out, and eventually was going to suffer and die. You know, perhaps he had a broken leg or something. So instead of letting the lion suffer, he says it's possible he jumped in, he slew the lion, as we would talk about a horse that has a broken leg they can't save, to put it down. But he jumps into the pit to do it. I mean, he could have used a bow and arrow. He could have used a spear. But he doesn't. He actually jumps into the pit with the lion. Now, a lion's in a pit and he's cornered is going to be pretty savage. So it's interesting, but that's all the Bible says about it. He jumps into a pit and kills a lion on a winter day. So it also tells us it's going to be wet and slippery down there. So he really didn't even have good footing. In verse 22, it says, "And such were the exploits of Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, that he too was as famous as the 3 mighty. He was held in greater honor than of the 30, but he was not included among the 3. So he did his best. He got into the 30. He was more honored than the 30, but not included with those 3. So amazing story. And so David, it says, it goes on, it says, so David put him in charge of his bodyguard. So David had enough faith, enough trust in him, that he literally put him in charge to protect David's life. All right, so now, I find all that absolutely fascinating, but there's another story I want to come to. And this is in the story of Adonijah setting himself up as a king. Because in the middle of all of this, David's got him as his personal bodyguard. He's got the strength. He's won the respect of the entire army. At some point, he's going to be in charge of the entire army. He's commanded 24,000 people at one time in one of the months of the service in the army. And now it's coming to the death of David. Now, this is a fascinating story because God not only prepared him and raised him in such a way that God used him to continue the lineage of David the way it was supposed to be and the way it was promised. And it eliminated an incredible civil strife that would have taken place had this man not came in along with Nathan, the prophet, to resolve the issue of who was literally going to be the king after David. All right, so I'm going to pick up the story now. Let's see, I'm in, gosh, I don't have the actual scripture down. I got the scriptures, but I don't have the actual scripture. This is where Adonijah set himself up as the king. Does anybody have that? Did you can find out right quick where that one's at? Just type in Adonijah revolt. We'll find that because I'd like to have that so you can follow along. I've got it written down here, but for some reason, and I was all over the place in the chapters. Just give me a few minutes. What's that? First Kings 8? 1 Kings 8, let's see. First Kings 1. Yeah, 1 Kings 1. 1 Kings 1. All right, 1 Kings 1. That's it, 1 Kings 1. All right. For those on the tape list, we'll have Jeff to cut out all that dead time. We'll be right back on target. In fact, I was doing a radio show with Linda this past week, and she went off target talking about something, and I'm thinking to myself, said, well, what does that got to do with this program? She goes, don't worry, that's not going to be in the program. We're going to cut it out later. I said, oh, okay. It was kind of funny. It took me off guard. All right, 1 Kings 1, verse 1. We'll start in verse 1. Okay. When King David was old and well advanced in years, he could not keep warm, and so they put covers over him. And we know the story that they went out and they looked for a young woman who had not been married and been with anybody. And she came in to take care of him, and she would lay next to him and keep him warm and keep his life going. He was still the king, and the power had not transferred over yet. And so it was important that he actually extend his life. Verse 3, so they searched the land for a beautiful girl, and they found Abishag, the Shunammite, and brought her to the king, and she was very beautiful, and she took care of the king, and he waited on him, but the king had no intimate relationships with her. Now, at this particular time, in verse 5, now Adonijah, whose mother was Haggath, had put himself forward and said, I will be king. He just declared himself king. The king's in the bed. He's dying. He's having a hard time keeping warm, so there's not much time left here. He declares himself to be king. So here's what he does to fool the people around him. If someone's going to have an overthrow, a coup, you have to go to certain leaders to make it work. Because if someone's in power, they have to be with you or it won't work. And you'll notice that in all coups, that's what goes on. They go behind the scenes to take people who are supposed to be loyal, but look beyond and say, okay, if this guy's going to be king, if I don't back him up, I'm going to be out of power. I'm going to lose all my favor. Who knows, maybe they'll come kill me. So they turn their back on the true king, and they go with this person because it was widely known by this time that Solomon was going to be the king because he'd already announced it. So the people now are beginning to see what's going on. So he got chariots, and he got horses ready with them, with 50 men to run ahead of that. So here we go now. We got this parade procession saying, here comes the next king. All right, so he's got the chariots, he's got men in front, and they're running. Who knows, maybe they got the banners, they got their swords, and it says, I will be king. So he gets the chariots and the horses, and 50 men run ahead. And his father had never interfered with him by asking, why do you behave as you do? He was also very handsome and was born next after Absalom, right? Interesting two pieces of information that was just put out there. The parent of this boy never interfered with telling him the difference between right and wrong. This might not have happened if the father would have said, no, you can't do this. Now, so that shows you there was a character flaw in this. All right, so, not his father, but his son. I mean, the wife is the interference, because David was his father. So it was the wife. So no one ever said anything, nor did David. It was interesting about David that he would let things happen, and quite often he even ran from his own son, remember? And instead of heading these problems head on, he hoped that God would simply intervene, and he would not try to interfere. And so here we have that even his dad David never said anything to stop it, what was going on. All right? And Adonijah conferred with Joab, the son of Zeruiah, with Abiathar the priest, and they gave him their support. So now he's got a priest, all right, and he's got the head of leadership in the nation who are backing him up to be able to do what he's doing. But Zadok, the priest, Benaiah, the son of Jehoshaphat, and Nathan the prophet, and David's special guard did not join Adonijah. So here we have the people who are loyal, and you're beginning to see the struggle that began to take place. Then Adonijah sacrificed sheep and cattle and fattened calves. And so he goes in and he starts inviting all his brothers and family members, but he did not invite because he knew where they stand. You ever get to where you're around certain people and they all huddled in corners in your businesses or work, and you don't really know what's going on? Why? Because they don't trust you. Why they don't trust you? Because you're faithful, you're loyal, and you're true. And people do that, believe it or not, when they want to talk about other people. When they're talking about gossip and hearsay, what they'll do is they will find people who have the itchy ear. But if they know you stand firm to the truth, you're left out. You're not invited in. Because, oh, we can't trust him. He's going to be, this jerk's going to hold fast to the truth. And they know that if you're brought in, you're going to stop what's going on. Now, it's funny how people will do this, is that if a person's got something they want to say about somebody, you know what they do? They throw test questions out. And you can find this, and this will help anybody in God's church. If you use this, it'll be a protection for you. People will come to you, and they will throw you out a test question to see if you are listening to or were willing to hear what they're about to tell you. They'll say, oh, did you know about so-and-so what they did last week? Now, what's the honest response? Really, I don't really want to know. You know, if it's anything bad, please don't tell me. But you know what people would like to do? No, I didn't know. What did they say? And then they'll throw out another test question. And if you're receptive to the negative thought wave that comes out, they got you. Because then it goes on, and it gets carried in, and that gossip and rumor and hearsay just starts spreading. Because you have broken down the principle that God says you don't hear an accusation against a brother, and especially against an elder in the church without two witnesses. And I'm telling you, there's more problems developed through the hearsay and gossip, not doctrine, that creates more problems in the church than you can imagine. It spreads like wildfire. Next thing you know, they're on the phone, they're testing somebody. You know, I have people call me up and they'll ask me certain things, and I said, well, listen, whatever you're about to tell me, I said, if it's gossip or something that's about somebody, I said, I can't hear it. And they said, oh, no, it's not. I said, okay. And then they'll tell me some gossip. I said, I just told you. I can't hear that. I said, we have to stop the conversation right now. And people get mad at you. But it happens over and over and over again. So here, that's the principle here, because these people knew where those men stood. So they didn't invite them in because they knew if they did, the coup could not take place. It says, but they did not invite Nathan the prophet or Benaiah or the special bodyguard or his brother Solomon. And so all these men were left out. So God inspires Nathan, because Nathan's the prophet. He's also the one who went in and told David, remember, because of this sin with Bathsheba, the child's going to die. Remember, he told him, and so So you see the personality of David, that as soon as he realized that he's the one that sinned, he admits to God every time, I'm at fault. It's my sin. All right? Whereas Saul, King Saul, he always made justifications and excuses, which is another character flaw that you can look at in people. When they find they do things wrong, they don't admit to being wrong. They make excuses and justify why. And usually they want to blame somebody else for what they just did. King David never did that. He never did that. All right, so verse 11. So Nathan asked Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king without our Lord David's knowing it? Now then, let me advise you how you can save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. That's what would have happened. If this would have continued, they would have had to kill Solomon because he was the rightful king. He was going to be the rightful king. And so when you have a coup takeover, normally what they'll do is they'll go in and kill the entire families so that there's no lineage can come in later on and soon rise up against them. He says, go into David and say to him, my Lord King, did you not swear to me by your servant that surely Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne? Why did Adonijah become king? So Nathan knew what he was doing. It was challenging. He said, well, you said this, David. How did he get to be the king? Now, David doesn't know this is going on. All right, so he's actually unaware of it. So it's a very small thing the way that Nathan did this through Solomon's mother, Bathsheba. So verse 15, so Bathsheba went in and saw the aged king in his room. And verse 16, Bathsheba bowed down, knelt before the king, and he said, what is it you want? And she said in verse 17, Lord, you yourself swore to me by your servant the Lord that Solomon your son shall be king, and he will sit on my throne. But now Adonijah has become king, and you, my Lord, did not know about it. He has sacrificed great numbers of cattle, fattened calves, and sheep, and he has invited all the king's sons, and Abiathar the priest, and Joab the commander of the army, but he has not invited Solomon your servant. My Lord King, the eyes of Israel are on you. It says, to learn from who will sit on the throne of my Lord the King after him. So he's telling him, so listen, it's up to you now to resolve this. You said this, and this is what's going on. Otherwise, verse 21, as soon as my Lord the King is laid to rest with his fathers, and my son Solomon will be treated as criminals. That's exactly what took place. So while she was still speaking with the king, Nathan the prophet arrived. Now, Nathan had sent her in first. Now, remember now, according to God, it has to have two witnesses. So Nathan set the story up so that the wife could go in first to bring it to David's attention what he said, to bring about the curious problem on what was taking place. Now, Nathan comes in as the second witness to confirm the story that she just said. See the wisdom that he used here. So instead of going into David and saying, you got to stop this, he let David, as the king, he let David do what David was supposed to do instead of telling him what to do. All right? Which was another piece of incredible of this story. Verse 24, so Nathan said, have you, my Lord, declared that Adonijah shall be king after you and that he will sit on your throne? Today he's gone down and he sacrificed great numbers of cattle, fattened calves, and sheep. He has invited all the king's sons and the commanders, exactly what he was just told through Bathsheba. Verse 26, and so when it goes on in verse 25, it says, right now they're eating and drinking and saying, long live King Adonijah. But me, your servant, and Zadok the priest, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and your servant Solomon, he did not invite. Is this something my Lord King has done without letting his servants know who would sit on the throne after him? All right, so now he's got David in that position. We'll try to bring this to a conclusion with the story of what actually takes place. So then David said, call Bathsheba, and so she came to the king's presence, and she stood before him. The king then took an oath. He said, as surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I will surely carry out today what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, that Solomon your son shall reign after me. He will sit on my throne and in my place. Then Bathsheba bowed her face low to the ground, and kneeling before the king, and said, May the Lord King David live forever. So then David called Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and they came before the king. These three men saved a civil war in Israel. This man was so faithful that he did not go to protect himself had this other king taken place. So now I just give you the paraphrase rest of the story. So then they go out and they actually have a parade. They actually begin, while this feasting is going on with the uprising, David starts in another city, brings in a parade and a procession with David's blessings, and they come in. When the uprising realizes that it's been thwarted, they didn't have the protection of Israel, the kings, they all fled for their lives. They all fled for their lives. Now, I want to conclude this with the forgiveness and the mercy of David, because it's so important that when people do us something wrong, they have the ability to forgive. So even though this man was trying to take over, look what he said. I'll pick it up in verse 47. He said, and also the royal officials have come to congratulate our Lord King David, saying, may God make Solomon's name more famous than yours, and his throne greater than yours. And the king bowed and worshipped in his head, and he said, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, has allowed my eyes to see a successor on my throne today. And at this, all of Adonijah's guests rose in alarm and dispersed. But Adonijah, in fear of Solomon, went and took hold on the horns of the altar. Now, what that means is that he's ready to thrust himself or take his own life. When you take the horns, it gives you the picture that is like falling on your sword. So Adonijah realized now, everybody left, that his coup attempt had failed, and he sends word to the king. He's got to know the love and forgiveness of David. His whole life, it says David never interfered when he tried to take over and he did things. David never stopped him. That here he hoped that David would again intervene. But at that point, he was ready to take his own life if the king chose for him to do that. So he says, so he went and took hold of the horns of the altar. Then Solomon was told, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon and is clinging to the horns of the altar. And he says, let Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. So he had to make sure that to try to keep peace in his own family, Solomon, tell me you're not going to kill your brother. When I'm gone, let me know that you're not going to kill your brother. So Solomon replied and said this, if he shows himself to be a worthy man, not a hair on his head will fall to the ground. But if evil is found in him, he will die. Now, if he can't show himself to be a man of trust, I'm not going to take a chance on him being around. I'm going to kill him. That's what he told David. Now, he's the king at this point. Solomon has the authority to kill his brother. And David's in the middle watching all this going on. So then King Solomon sent men, and they brought him down to the altar. And Adonijah came, and he bowed down to the King Solomon. And Solomon said, go to your home. He let him live. Incredible story that built around, that took years in the making through Benaiah. The protection that God had set in place for events that would take place down the road. So let me close with this. In each one of our lives, chances are we'll never be what you would look in Isaiah in Hebrews 11 as these mighty men, where Daniel was thrown into the lion's den that God interferes. You know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But in the middle of all of that, God has laid out a plan for you. He's laid out a plan for me. And those plans sometimes go unnoticed now, but God is recording them in history for you. Somewhere, God is developing your character. He's molding you and He's shaping you because you have been called, and you're not called for no reason. It's that through these people who are, as I say, less known characters in the Bible, you and I may be of those less known characters, but the events that God has you do are no less important than that of King David. or Abraham or some of the others, because God is not a respecter of person. So you have to develop the character, the faith, the trust, and the love, and the fearlessness that God is giving to you to get ready for your task. Because we don't know where it'll be or how, and it may be in your walk every single day of what you do. These people, God has recorded for you and I. And there's so much more that we can glean from it. And this is only one character of the lesser-known people in the Bible. And hopefully this year we'll cover a lot more and see what else God has recorded for you and I that we can glean and help grow our life as we prepare for the return of Christ.